It's pretty wild to think that the first psychological tests were really more like art than science. Today, we're going to dive into the fascinating and honestly pretty dramatic story of psychological testing. We'll see how a new scientific approach completely changed the game, what happened during the turbulent period of rapid change that followed, and what the current environment looks like, where these tests have a massive impact on everything we do.
Have you ever had that feeling where your entire future feels like it's hanging on a single test score? I mean, maybe it was the SAT for college or a personality test for a job. These things are a huge part of our world, but have you ever just stopped and wondered, how did they get so powerful? Well, that's exactly what we're going to unpack.
All right, let's hop in the time machine and head back to the 1940s. This was a time when the world of psychological testing was, well, on the verge of a complete revolution. A new scientific approach was bubbling up, and believe me, it was about to change everything.
So, before this big shift, the go-to methods were what we call projective tests. You've probably heard of the famous Rorschach ink blots, right? A psychologist would basically look at your answers and decide what they meant based on their own judgment. But this new wave, the empirical tests, just threw that whole idea out the window. It said, nope, meaning can't just be assumed. It has to be proven with actual data.
The MMPI, which came out in 1943, was a total game changer. It was built on this really radical idea that you can't just guess what an answer means. Like, a psychologist might think that if you answer true to, "I sometimes get angry," that's a sign of a problem. But the MMPI's creators were like, hold on, let's check the data. And what they found was that what really mattered wasn't one single answer, but a pattern of answers that could scientifically tell one group of people apart from another. This was a huge shift from intuition to evidence.
And right around the same time, psychologists were also cooking up some powerful new statistical tools. So instead of getting lost in a whole laundry list of similar words like outgoing, talkative, and gregarious, they could use this method called factor analysis to find the one core idea they all point to, in this case, extroversion. This let them build tests that were way more focused and way more reliable.
Okay, so with these amazing new scientific tools, you'd think psychological testing was set for a golden age, right? Smooth sailing from here on out? Well, the story took a really unexpected turn. The rise of testing was incredibly fast, but its fall from grace was just as quick and just as dramatic.
What's just wild about this slide is the speed of this whole boom and bust cycle. After World War II, clinical psychology basically becomes a real profession, and testing is its unique skill. By the early 50s, psychologists are at peak status, working alongside doctors, using tests to help with diagnoses. But then, just a few years later, the whole field is in a freefall. Both psychologists and the public started turning against testing. So what on earth happened?
So what was the real problem here? Well, these brilliant post-war psychologists were just frustrated. They felt like they were being treated like second-class citizens, like they were just technicians for doctors. They could administer all these tests, but they couldn't practice psychotherapy on their own. So a lot of them just started rejecting testing altogether because it became a symbol of that secondary status.
But the story doesn't end there in the 1970s, not by a long shot. While a lot of psychologists were turning their backs on testing because of these professional battles, the actual need for objective measurement, that didn't just vanish. In fact, that need was about to come roaring back stronger than ever, which brings us to today's environment and the modern testing boom.
So what drove this massive comeback? It was really the explosion of new, specialized fields that absolutely depend on psychological tests. Neuropsychologists needed them to figure out the effects of brain injuries. Forensic psychologists started using them in the legal system to assess things like a person's competency to stand trial. And in health and child psychology, tests just became essential tools. Every new field created this huge new demand for really sophisticated testing. And the scale of this new boom, it's just staggering. Let's just look at a few numbers to get a feel for it. Back in 2010, in a single year, high school students took over 3.2 million AP exams. And remember, that's just one type of test for one specific group of students.
The numbers for getting into higher education are even bigger. In that same year, you had about 1.6 million high school seniors taking the SAT. Almost 700,000 people took the GRE to get into grad school, and nearly 150,000 took the LSAT for law school. These tests have really become the main gatekeepers for so many careers.
Okay, but if you thought those numbers were big, get ready for this one. This number really shows the global scale of where we are now.
The Educational Testing Service, or ETS, that's the company behind the SAT and GRE, administers more than 50 million tests every single year in 181 countries. That's the mind-blowing reach and power of the modern testing industry.
So, after this whole whirlwind tour, the scientific revolution, the professional drama, this explosive modern growth, you might be sitting there thinking, okay, that's interesting, but why does this really matter to me? Well, it actually matters a whole lot more than you might think.
Here's the big takeaway. You absolutely do not have to be a psychologist to be affected by these tests. It doesn't matter if you're a student, a parent, a manager, a doctor, a lawyer. Chances are you are going to encounter the results of these tests in your life. And that's why it's so important for all of us to have a handle on where they came from, what their strengths are, and what their limitations are too.
And this leads us to a really powerful idea. Because these tests are so woven into the fabric of our society, we all have a stake in how they're used. Being an informed citizen, or parent, or professional means you can actually help make sure these powerful tools are used in constructive, helpful ways and not misused.
So, we end with this really big question. We've seen that tests are more powerful and more widespread than they have ever been in human history. The decisions they influence are critical. So the challenge for all of us is to ask, how do we as a society make sure that these tools are used wisely, ethically, and fairly?